Hey, today we are looking at the New Answers book, lesson number 7, and it's talking about carbon 14 dating. And the question it says is, doesn't carbon 14 dating disprove the Bible? Before we get into this lesson, I just want to talk a little bit about this, is more kind of concentrating on Bible, but we have to understand some of the basic science. And I am not a scientist, I'm not a science teacher. But hopefully, I can get you, and through your reading of it, get you to a basic understanding, which will help make this make sense to you. Okay. Um, it starts with the very first paragraph on page 77. Says scientists use a technique called radiometric dating to estimate the age of rocks, fossils, and the Earth. Many people have been led to believe that radiometric dating methods have proved the Earth to be billions of years old. This has caused many in the church to reevaluate the biblical creation account, specifically the meaning of the word day in Genesis 1. With our focus on one particular form of radiometric dating, carbon dating, we will see that carbon dating strongly supports a young Earth. Note that, contrary to a popular misconception, carbon dating is not used to date rocks that are millions of years old. Okay? So let's start with some of the basics of science. The basic building block of all matter is the atom. Atoms are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Okay? The protons and neutrons make up the center or the nucleus, and the electrons make up the shell that's around the nucleus. The number of protons in the nucleus determines what the element is. Example, all carbon atoms have 6 protons, and all nitrogen atoms have 7 protons, okay? The number of neutrons in the nucleus can vary. A carbon atom could have 6, 7, or 8 neutrons, but it always has 6 protons, thus making it carbon. So an isotope is any several different forms of an element, each having a different number of neutrons. Radioactive decay is unstable isotopes that spontaneously change into another kind of atom. This process presently happens at a known measured rate, and scientists attempt to use it to determine how long ago a rock or a fossil was formed. Okay, so and then we also have two main applications for radiometric dating. One is potentially dating fossils using carbon 14 dating, and the second is dating rocks and the age of the Earth using uranium, potassium, and other radioactive atoms. Okay, so carbon 14 dating. I know we're going to get through it, I promise. Carbon 14 dating, this is the claim. It's radiocarbon, okay? It's also known as radiocarbon. To be a reliable dating method for determining the age of fossils up to 50,000 or 60,000 years. That's the claim. If true, it disproves the Bible's young Earth of 6,000 years old. When scientists' interpretation of data does not match the clear meaning of the text in the Bible, we should never reinterpret the Bible, okay? Just keep that in mind as we go through this. So here's some questions about carbon 14 dating. Is the explanation of the data derived from empirical observational science or an interpretation of past events, historical science? Are there any assumptions involved in the dating method? Are the dates provided by carbon 14 dating consistent with what we observe? And do all scientists accept carbon 14 dating method as reliable and accurate? And the answers to those are these, okay? The procedures used are not necessarily in question. The interpretation of past events is in question. The carbon 14 is mostly used to date once living things, and carbon 14 can't be used directly to date rocks, but only gives dates in the thousands of year range, not millions, okay? So carbon isotopes, let's talk about those for just a minute. There are 3 different actually occurring varieties, okay? A carbon 12, a carbon 13, and a carbon 14. Carbon 12 and carbon 13 are stable. Carbon 14 is unstable, which means it's radioactive, okay? Radioactive means that the carbon 14 will decay or emit radiation over time and become a different element. The radioactive process is called beta decay. And this is where a neutron in the carbon-14 atom will be converted into a proton and an electron. Carbon-14 then, at that point, is changed into nitrogen. So, carbon-14 is supposed to be constantly replenishing, okay? It's constantly being added to the atmosphere through the cosmic rays. After being produced, carbon-14 combines with oxygen in the atmosphere. Carbon-12 and carbon-14 combine in oxygen to create CO2 or carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide in the plants we eat equals all the things that should have the same ratio of carbon-12 and carbon-14 in them as in the air that we breathe. Okay, so basically they're saying it's constantly replenishing. The level that's in everything should be the same as the air we breathe. So how does the carbon-14 dating process work? So as long as an organism is alive, it will take in the carbon-14. Right? It's in the air. As soon as you breathe it in and take it in, it's continuously taking in. But when it dies and we stop breathing, the thing stops living, it stops taking in the carbon-14. Part of the process involves measuring the amount of carbon-14 that remains after some has been lost. Okay? So we stop taking it in, it starts to change and break down, and we start to lose it, and that's what they're trying to measure. Scientists use a device called an accelerated mass spectrometer. Think NCIS or something like that, right? But they use this machine to try to measure. It increases the assumed accuracy to about 80,000 years. Two things that we need to know, okay, to make this accurate. How fast does carbon-14 decay? This is known as a half-life of something. The half-life definition is the amount of time it takes for half of the atoms in a sample to decay. The half-life of carbon-14 is 5,730 years. Also, we need to know what was the starting amount of carbon-14 in the creature when it died. This is essential to determine the half-life. Scientists use an isotope of carbon-12, which is stable, to help them determine this. The ratio of carbon-14 and carbon-12 in living creatures will be the same as in the atmosphere. So the ratio is basically 1 to 1 trillion. Okay, there's a chart on page 82 of your book that kind of looks at some of this. Okay, so just if you want, you can take a look at that. But so in essence, they have a stable compound or stable element that they're looking at that should be equal while it's living to the unstable element. And once it dies, that unstable element will start to decay, and then they can compare the two and see what happens. However, there is one critical assumption that they make, okay? And that critical assumption is this, okay? In your book on page 82, it says, assumptions in the scientific community are extremely important. If the starting assumption is false, all the calculations based on that assumption might be correct, but still give a wrong conclusion. So if the ratio of carbon-14 and carbon-12 always bring the same as it was today, that's one of the assumptions. If true, the carbon-14 dating is valid up to about 80,000 years. Beyond that, there's not enough carbon-14 to date. If false, they're incorrect dates. And that's the assumption that they've made. Dr. Libby has studied this, and he says if the Earth started with no carbon-14, it would take up to 30,000 years to reach equilibrium. The study shows that we are still not in equilibrium. So if Dr. Libby is correct, then we have to choose this. The evolutionists would have to choose to ignore that data. So in order to get to equilibrium, it equals 1 to 1 trillion, as the assumption states. And he said it would take 30,000 years, and we're not still currently at that equilibrium. There's a problem with their hypothesis, correct? Possibly, based on his data, the Earth is not very old, right? If it takes up to 30,000 years to reach equilibrium, we haven't reached there. One could assume, based on his data, that the Earth is less than 30,000 years old. But there's also things that can affect the production of carbon-14 in the atmosphere. The magnetic field of the Earth. The magnetic field can decay. Decay could result in a smaller production of carbon-14. Another thing that could affect this is the Genesis flood, where fossil fuels created by the flood would be in these living organisms that were quickly buried and had, 500 times more carbon than today. Ultimately, what this lesson is trying to show you is that all radiometric dating methods are based on assumptions about events that happened in the past, okay? Assumptions have been accepted as true and give false dates. When the assumptions are evaluated and shown to be faulty, the results support the biblical account of a global flood and a young earth. Make sure you read this. It's a little bit challenging, but it shows that depending on your worldview, and even, Dr. Libby is an evolutionist, and he himself even shows his data that the Earth should be less than 30,000 years old. So make sure you read this and try not to get too confused. Thanks.